Thanksgiving games are on their way this week. And this is the running back rankings heading into Thursday for these Thanksgiving games. So the first guy is Ezekiel Elliott of the Dallas Cowboys. He had a bad few weeks for the last month since Dak Prescott was out. But in Week 11, Ezekiel Elliott, he finally woke up to the occasion. And he had his first 100-yard game of the season, 21 carries for 103 yards. And he caught 2 balls for 11 yards. So Zeke, he looked good. He looked healthy. This Dallas offense, for once, it looked like Dalton had time behind the offensive line. We're making adjustments, putting Zach Martin to right guard. So Elliott here, he looked quicker as well in this game. And he versed a decent Minnesota team. And now he's got Washington coming up here in Week 12. And last time versus Washington, it was a total train wreck for Dallas. But I think this week it's going to be better for them. They're indoors. They're at home this time. Last time it was rainy, wet, and just bad weather conditions. So I think Elliott in this game could have a huge game with 100 total yards and 1 or 2 touchdowns. Believe it or not, these two teams, they're struggling and they're horrible. But this is a first-place matchup pretty much for the NFC East. So Ezekiel Elliott, he's my number 1 running back on the Thanksgiving games. Number 2 is James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, another guy who's been struggling the last few weeks, but in Week 11, he came back with a nice bounce-back game. It was James Conner here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Conner with 13 carries, 89 yards, 3 catches, 10 yards. The only thing with Conner, I don't like his workload. They're not giving him more than 12 to 15 carries or touches a game. Again, in this ball game in Week 11, he fell short with 16. But this matchup versus Baltimore, it's going to be more of a battle in the trenches, I believe. And Conner had a pretty good game last time versus Baltimore. 15 carries, 47 yards, a touchdown, and also 3 catches for 13 yards. So Conner, if he could get 15 to 18 touches and get that touchdown at the goal line, I think he'll be all right. And I think he'll be the second best running back on Thanksgiving. The third guy is Deandre Swift. This is depending if he's going to play or not. Swift missed Week 11 with the concussion, and Swift, hopefully he comes back, because when he was named the starter in Week 10, Swift had a huge ball game that week with 25 fantasy points, 81 rushing yards, 5 catches, 68 yards, and a touchdown versus Washington. And now here in Week 12, he versus Houston on Thanksgiving. That gives up the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs. And Swift, I could see him have a good ball game in this one. Hopefully he plays. As of now, the report says he didn't play or practice at all. He was on the side doing some work, so hopefully he's cleared by Thursday. So Deandre Swift's the 3rd running back. The 4th guy is Antonio Gibson of the Washington football team. And Gibson, he's been doing well the last 3 or 4 weeks now. They're getting him the ball more. He's getting more touches. In Week 11, he's coming off a nice ball game versus Cincinnati, 94 yards, a rushing touchdown, and 1 catch for 10 yards. And now this week he versus a weak Dallas Cowboy defense that he had a huge fantasy game versus 20 carries, 128 yards, and a touchdown against in Week 7. So Gibson here, he's going to get the work. We know Mckissick's there also, but he's the passing downs back. And Gibson, game script or not, he's going to get 15, 20 touches each and every week. And he's a guy moving up the rankings as the weeks is going on. So he's the 4th running back. The 5th is his teammate, J.D. Mckissick. Mckissick, he's been a receiving machine in PPR leagues, is Mckissick. And this week he versus the Dallas Cowboys, who have trouble with pass catches and running backs. Just in a hole, they can't stop nobody, is this Cowboy team. And Mckissick having 35 targets in his last 3 games. He's their passing downs back. He's putting in a lot of big games and a lot of usage, is Mckissick. He had a little bit of a down game last week versus Cincinnati, but he still had 10 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And in the last matchup versus Dallas, because the game script, they were blowing him out, he only had 7. But this week, it's going to be a close game, I think, in Dallas. Back and forth battle. Like I said, for the division right here, this game is. And I think Mckissick, he could get you anywhere from 12 to 15 points. And he's a good play. Number 6, Duke Johnson. Johnson's been the starter now the last 2 weeks. And he's had bad performances. And he's been struggling, as Duke. But this week he's got a great matchup versus the Detroit Lions, who give up the most fantasy points to running backs. But Duke, in his first 2 starts in Week 10, only 14 carries, 54 yards. So he didn't even get a catch. But in that ball game in Cleveland, the weather was bad, and just the game script wasn't fitting. But we'll give him a pass there. And then last week versus Houston, only 10 carries for 15 yards. That's a bad game. And 5 targets, 3 catches, 20 yards. So Duke Johnson, if he could get, 40 total yards and a touchdown with 3 or 4 catches, that'll be a decent game for him. But I don't like what he's doing. But he's one of the only running backs in fantasy football right now. There's probably 10 to 15 that get a full workload and volume, and that's why Johnson's 6th on this list. I think he could have a decent game. Like I said, Detroit gives up the most fantasy points to running back, so hopefully Duke Johnson breaks out this week on the Thanksgiving. The 7th guy is Gus Edwards of the Baltimore Ravens, and Gus Edwards, he's getting a start here after Mark Ingram and J.K. Dobbins, who finally broke out last week, went on the COVID list. And Gus Edwards, he's a serviceable running back, and he's going to get short yardage. He's getting goal line carries. So I like Edwards' outlook. I think he could get you 40 total yards and a touchdown, and he's a good flex to low number 2 option in this game. In his last 3 weeks, Week 8, 16 carries, 87 yards and a touchdown when Ingram was out. Week 9, 11 for 23 and a touchdown, and he also added 2 catches for 11 yards. And then last week in New England, when all the running backs were there, 7 carries, 42 yards, and a catch for 31 yards. So Edwards, he still had a role in the offense. But now he's the man over there with the top 2 running backs. Like I said, Ingram and Dobbins out. So I put Edwards as the 7th guy. He's in a tough matchup versus Pittsburgh, who gives up the least amount of fantasy points to running backs. But I still think he could have a decent game. The 8th guy is his teammate, Justice Hill. This team is so deep at running back. Justice Hill, he could be a backup on many teams, and he's the 4th string running back here for the Baltimore Ravens, and he's a guy I advise you to go out there and get if you got injuries or bye or whatever. Hill, he's going to come in, he's going to play. That's the passing downs back, and that's what the Ravens need. Edwards, like I said, he'll get the in-between the tackles, and he'll be the outside and 3rd down passing downs back. So I wouldn't be surprised if he has 4 or 5 catches in this game for 50 or 60 yards, so he's a decent sneaky play this week. The 9th running back's Tony Pollard of the Dallas Cowboys. Tony Pollard, he's been playing well the last 4 or 5 weeks, and we saw Pollard have a 42-yard scamper versus the Minnesota Vikings in Week 11. 5 carries, 60 yards, and a touchdown. 3 weeks before that, though, Pollard, he was getting the workload more when Zeke was having the fumbling issues. But Pollard, he's not a bad guy as a backup. He's only owned in 20% of fantasy leagues. So if you need a guy in a real deep league to start, he's not a bad option. This week is Tony Pollard. I could see him getting 8 to 12 touches in this game and maybe have another touchdown like he did last week. And the 10th and final guys, Adrian Peterson of the Detroit Lions. Even if Swift's out and Peterson starts, his value isn't that good. Last week, he only had 1.8 fantasy points with Peterson, and he's got a good matchup, I understand, versus Houston, who gives up the 3rd most fantasy points to rushes. But Peterson, he won't get you catches out of the backfield. He's not going to be a crazy runaway speed running back anymore. So if he could get you a goal line scamper and 50, 60 yards, he'll work out. But if he's not starting, he's going to get 3 or 4 touches this game if Swift's back. So that's the Thanksgiving running back rankings heading into Thursday's game.